day 5 of the Spring Break Challenge. Almost to the end, folks. Almost there. Now I'm back in my apartment after getting back from the beach, so now let's review something in an anime that I personally consider a little underrated. Mardock Scramble, the first impression. Now, Mardock is one of those animes that I have been kind of curiously looking out from the outside for a while now, mostly because of the person who created the series, Tow Ubakata, is now associated with what is going to be the prequel to one of my favorite anime franchises, Ghost in the Shell. So I thought to myself, okay, if this person is going to be now what I think is, he's the writer for the Ghost in the Shell Arise series, I might as well make myself more familiar with what he's done in the past and see what else he's done. And his biggest work to date is what's known as Mardock Scramble. So I thought to myself, okay, I'll take a look at that. It's Cyberpunk, it's sort of in line with Ghost in the Shell, and take a look at it. And so I went out and tried to search for the first movie, because I found out that this is actually part 1 of a trilogy. There's the first impression, there's the second combustion, and the third exhaust. So now I found the first impression, so what are my thoughts on it? Just from the opening of this video, you can already tell that I already like Mardock Scramble quite a bit, and here's why. Now, the story follows a young lady named Rumbolo who is a prostitute in a place called Communist City and is nearly murdered by her caretaker, Shell Septonius. However, she is saved from being murdered thanks to the efforts of Dr. Easter and an AI mouse named Ulfkog, and now she has to adapt to this new life of a cybernetic body, as well as trying to stay alive while Shell and his goons are trying to take care of Rumbolo and try to kill her and make sure she stays dead, from keeping her from testifying against him in court. Now I'm going to get straight into my pros and cons with this movie. What I love about this movie is the fact that it does not feel like a typical revenge story, at least in my opinion. And what I mean by that is that whenever you see a revenge story, I mean, everyone loves a good revenge story, watching the person get back at the person who did them wrong. And true, Below feels like she gets that a little way, but she doesn't go on this actual revenge killing spree. It's not like, say, Kill Bill, where something like she's left for dead at her wedding, and then all of a sudden she goes out and takes out all these people who did her wrong, including the person who actually killed her, supposedly. But in this story, Below is brought back, and while she does want answers for what Shell did to her in the store at the beginning of the movie, she's not actually so focused on the revenge itself. She's more or less concerned about trying to move on and trying to figure out where to go from here, and whether she wants to completely forget about the past or what she might want to do in the future. I mean, she's very conflicted about what she wants to do, or even if she wants to live or die. And she's not the only one that's trying to find her own place in the world, because of the AI mouse named Ulfkog, I mentioned earlier, is also trying to find a place in the world, because he is developed as a weapon. He can turn into pretty much anything the person wants, and just think of it, the person can turn into it, within reason. There are certain limitations to what he can do. But he is also trying to figure out his own place in the world, and the relationship between Ulfkog and Below is something I feel like is very genuine. They both are lost souls, or want to find their place in the world, and they want to figure out their use and what they want to do with their lives. And in Ulfkog's mind, helping Below in a way is helping him serve his own purpose and saying I want to help people, I want to be useful, and by helping this girl solve this case and deal with their own murder, I feel like this can help me demonstrate my usefulness to humans. So watching these two work together is actually something I enjoy a lot throughout the course of this movie. Now, another aspect of this film, I can't say that I love this aspect, but I certainly respect it, is the fact that it doesn't really hold back in terms of some of the subject matters that are involved with the movie, and in terms of some of the graphic imagery that's involved, especially in the director's cut. I don't want to give away what those elements are, but let's just say there are certain elements to the story that really emphasize the damaged nature that Below is enduring throughout the course of the story, or at least you understand why she is screwed up, or why she feels as damaged as she is, because of the fact that she's had a very abusive life. And an aspect that stems off of that concern is the fact that there is a lot of nudity in this film, particularly with the director's cut. Not so much in the theatrical cut for obvious reasons, but in a way I feel like the director's cut with the nudity on is actually serving it to the movie's favor, and saying that, yes, I understand that nudity is something like a problem when it comes to people and saying that, oh, it's just fan service for the sake of fan service. Okay, personally, I try to overlook issues like that, but in this particular case, I felt like it actually served a purpose in that the nudity itself never felt glorified. It never felt like it was romanticized. It was like, oh, wow, she is so hot, and it's just like, oh, look at those big breasts, or look at that really nice ass. I mean, just nothing like that. Yes, Below is quite exposed throughout the course of the movie, but again, it never felt glorified. It felt like, in a way, it actually helped sort of a metaphorical sense in that it showed how exposed she was and how vulnerable she was throughout the course of the movie. And seeing that she's still unsure of herself. And I know this is starting to sound a little pretentious, I apologize for that, but this is honestly what I was thinking as of course I was watching this. She is very vulnerable and she's very unsure of herself, and she wants to just she wants to find a way to protect herself and be loved by those around her, but she has been constantly refused and betrayed by so many people and used by a lot of other individuals that she really doesn't know who to trust. But this nudity itself actually gives a visual representation of that such exposure and vulnerability. Now, I know in most of the other movies I've watched, I've always commented on the soundtrack and saying I usually like the soundtrack. But in this one, I like this one a little bit more than others because of how flexible they use the instruments. And what I mean by that, in particular, one instrument, the piano, they use the piano in such a versatile manner, it feels like they're using it to its fullest advantage in that it can emphasize different tones and different aspects of the movie itself. For example, their piano is used in the soundtrack as well as in the movie to emphasize moments of subtlety and quietness, and like sitting at a bar, something that's supposed to be relaxing, maybe a little bit of lounge music. But then again, at certain other aspects of the movie, they use that piano, the same notes or maybe the same tune, to emphasize something a little bit more chaotic or unstable. And maybe that's regarding a certain character or maybe a certain aspect or time in the movie in terms of plot progression. And it really used it to a versatile manner, and I really love that. And it's like, that's how you do an effective soundtrack. It almost feels like the soundtrack in itself becomes a character alongside with the movie. And I feel like that's the best type of soundtrack. One that becomes a character that emphasizes and enhances the mood of the movie and gives it personality. Another aspect of this film I really enjoy is the fact that Below herself doesn't talk. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Is that during the course of the movie, and during her murder, she comes to realize, once she realizes that her cybernetic body is now hers, she can't actually talk because of her vocal cords were damaged due to her murder. And so, whenever you see her talk, she actually isn't like moving her lips and talking, actually, like the movements of her lips are not actually syncing up to what she's saying. And while Below can talk through different devices in the movie, is that you don't really see her like moving her jaw up and down and moving her lips accordingly to what she is saying or thinking. So in a way, she has to emote a lot more through her face, emoting how desperate she is, how happy she is, how curious she is. And that is a very hard thing to do for something like an animated movie or an anime, in that you have to visually express yourself through your face. And that's really hard to do. Even in live action, that's really hard to do when you can't talk. But in a way, she can still talk through devices like Offcock, who helps her be able to speak in a way. But, and again, I feel like she herself can't talk. And this is yet. I'm saying yet because while I have not seen the second movie, I'm going to guess that there is going to be an aspect where she does get her voice back. But in a way, I feel like it's better that she doesn't have her voice back in this movie because it shows that her visuals and her facial expressions are very indicative and very emotive to what she's actually thinking. Another aspect I find really enjoyable about this movie is its art style. Now, I know I've commented before on how I always love the art style. I always love it when something is very colorful, very vibrant, and alive. But in this aspect, Communist City, the environment where Below lives in, is not exactly the most visually vibrant in the world. I mean, it's very bleak, it's very muted, and it feels like a very dark, like dirty city, and then you just feel wet and just feel disgusted living there. It's like no one really wants to live there. It's more like they're living there out of circumstances. But they use this aspect of the movie, the darkness of the movie, to its advantage in that they oversaturate certain colors to emphasize the mood of that scene. In saying, like, they use, like, the warm colors, like, say, between Ulfcock and Below, to emphasize the camaraderie and the friendship that they have. Whereas certain cooler aspects were emphasizing the lonely aspects of Below's life, or maybe a little bit darker hues to more sadistic and deformed or crazy nature of the city and the citizens living within it, or maybe the people that are hunting Below or trying to testify against Shell. So again, the art style and the soundtrack emphasize the mood of the movie itself, which is they help build the atmosphere of the movie, which is what they are supposed to do. And the last 15-20 minutes of this movie completely kick ass. Whereas Below, you see her grow over the course of the movie, realizing that she has to come to terms with not only her past, but also her own nature and her own power, in that she has this cybernetic body and she can do all these really cool things. But throughout this movie, you see her and Ulfcock bounce off each other and saying, like, look, I can't really force you to do anything. You have to enforce your own rules. You may have all this really cool power and all these really neat abilities for you to do, but you need to know when to use them wisely and at the right time, and never abuse that power. And in certain aspects, Below may forget that, and realizing that she is still learning to adapt to this new life. And during the last 15-20 minutes of this movie, you actually see that come to a head, and realizing that maybe she's kind of tilting on that edge of going from being responsible but also abusing that power to the point of being just as crazy and maybe evil as the other people who are trying to kill her. In a sense, she's both becoming predator and prey at the same time. One last note with the last 15-20 minutes is that it does end on a cliffhanger, which I will admit kind of ticks me off a little bit, but what a cliffhanger in my mind is supposed to make you interested in wanting to continue the series and wanting to continue the story, and this cliffhanger did it perfectly. I loved the cliffhanger, I loved where it left off, it made me suspenseful and made me curious as like I must see the second chapter like right now, and so it did its job. I know I've done nothing but praise this movie throughout the course of this review, but I will say there is one small nitpick that I do have with this movie that I felt like could have been addressed, or at least enhanced a little bit, and that is it doesn't really have to do with the movie itself. It's more of what happens during the end credits. There's a certain song that plays during the end credits that I felt like was a little too cliche and cheesy, and I felt like it didn't I understand why they picked it and I understand how it fits, but I felt like they could have done more with the soundtrack and say, well, why not make an original theme or something like that. Granted, for what the theme they chose and what the song they picked, it was fine. I just felt like they could have done a little bit more with it. However, that's such a small gripe in terms of my overall thoughts on Mardock Scramble. It really doesn't affect my overall rating, so I'll have to put that aside. So my overall thoughts on the movie is that it had a really sweet, interesting take on the revenge story. It had a very likable relationship between Ulfcock and Below and people who want to find a meaning to their life and using each other to try and find their own purpose and their way in the world. The art style and the soundtrack served the complement of the movie and the atmosphere itself and helped emphasize the mood of the characters, which is what they should do. A cliffhanger that made me more than interested in seeing the second one, and also making full use of facial expressions in order to give a solid emotion and emphasis on what she's actually thinking. My overall thoughts on Mardock Scramble is that I think it is worth every penny. So everybody, those are my thoughts on Mardock Scramble, the first compression. That should be day 5 of this review. Hopefully, I apologize for getting my last review up a little bit late. The YouTube load times were a pain in the butt. But hopefully I can get this review out a little bit faster. And until next time, I'm Perry, the One-Armed Legend. You name it, I can play it.